Hello, welcome back everybody. It's Aaron here at the Battle of Prestonpans Museum in a very cold and frosty East Lothian. I hope you've had a fantastic start to the year, but it is high time we looked back at what's happened in our campaign over the festive period. It has been a dramatic, hard-marching and bloody few weeks. Let's have a look. Let's just take a step back to how the invasion of England had begun. As the Jacobites had returned from the Highlands, they had driven Henry Hawley's army back into retreat towards Carlisle, where they were hoping to link up with the even more powerful army of the Duke of Cumberland that was coming up that coast. Jacobite forces had initially trailed them and then suddenly swung out towards Peebles, heading for the border. Now, all this time, a second column of Jacobite soldiers, the slower-moving French and Lowland troops with the artillery train, had been moving in parallel, and they were heading towards the border too. They hoped that they had done enough to keep the British forces on the western side of England, whilst the Jacobite advance dodged towards the east. Now, you'll notice that there is a small red circle in front of the Jacobite Lowland column. That is the Georgia Rangers, who had been detached earlier in the campaign to keep an eye on these eastern roads, just in case the Jacobites did attempt to head down towards Berwick or Newcastle. And indeed, needless to say, what happened is that as the campaign now developed, the Georgia Rangers, retiring ahead of the Lowland column, found themselves trapped between the Lowland and the Highland columns of the Jacobites marching into England. Eventually, they were caught, completely surprised by the Jacobite horse coming up from the rear. This is down just outside Lauder, and the Jacobites were basically sending a reinforcement to the Lowland column from the Highland column, and that reinforcement ran straight into the rear of the Georgia Rangers and dispersed them without really a fight. The Rangers may well rally at Berwick for a role later in the campaign, but for the time being, they are knocked out of action. An early success for the Jacobites campaign as it heads towards England. Just having a look then at our strategic situation as the Jacobite campaign moves into Northumberland. You can see the two dotted lines there, the Highland column moving out from Lanark towards Peebles and then down in towards the border regions. And you can see the point where near Lauder the two columns came close to each other, and that's where the Rangers were surprised. The Jacobites continue in two separate columns, taking advantage of the higher speed of the Highland units as they press towards Newcastle. The challenge for Hawley and Cumberland as they switch into reverse gear and move back into the northwest of England is whether they should try and cut across and rescue Newcastle, if that's the Jacobite objective, or whether they should try and march parallel to any Jacobite advance into central England and then cross the Pennines a little bit further down. That's what our British Army decides to do. Let's not underestimate the conditions these two armies are marching in. This is cold weather, difficult roads, lots of streams and rivers to cross as the Jacobite army, you can see it here, snaking its way through the Northumbrian countryside in the snows of December 1745. The Prince rallying his men and cheering them on, encouraging them to great feats, because if they can penetrate deep into England, then they not only have a chance of a run at London, they also have the prospect of bringing the French fully into the war. Our British team aren't hanging about either. They send their army through on a parallel course down the northwest of England, heading towards the Skipton Gap, where they can cut across and hopefully reach Yorkshire before the Jacobites can penetrate too deep towards the Midlands. And now they are helped in this campaign by the fact that the Jacobite columns have to, if they're going to have the strength to be able to face a battle in England, unite. And so at Durham, the Jacobites spend several days, crucial days as it would turn out, allowing the Lowland column to catch up. Then, only once their forces are reunited at Durham do they continue the march. That lost few days, however, gives Cumberland the chance to get ahead of them, to cut across from the Pennines and to block the road south. So this is the landscape our armies are moving into, the Duke of Cumberland coming in from the west to Wetherby. He has to then consider whether it's worth pushing on to York over here, the symbolic heart of northern England, of course, and a city which has had its militia ordered up to Newcastle to strengthen the garrison there, so is perhaps feeling a little bit vulnerable. However, Henry Hawley's column of the British Army is marching a day behind, so Cumberland does want to concentrate his forces before any engagement. The other issue is, of course, that the main road, in fact, bypasses York. It comes down this way, through Walshford and Wetherby, and heads off that way. And Fulk informs him from his cavalry pickets that the Jacobite army is coming that direction. Cumberland has a couple of days. He has time to allow Hawley to catch up, and he has time to consider where he might make a defence. You can see clearly on this map there are defensible lines. There is the River Nid, and beyond it the River Wharfe. So there are two potential lines here where they could block an advance. And Cumberland spends his time looking at the space between these two rivers and comes up with a plan. Now, you might think it was obvious. You can just block the river crossings in this area and invite the Jacobites to throw themselves against defensive crossing points, perhaps like the Jacobites had forced Marshal Wade to do at Bannockburn. But actually, they're not likely to want to do that. They're either going to try and bypass the position or move on York, for example, or they're simply going to settle in the north of England and force you to come to them. So actually, Cumberland doesn't want to make his position so strong that the Jacobites won't attack it. Rather, he wants them to blunder into him on a ground that he has chosen and which allows him to use the advantages of his massed firepower and his cavalry supremacy. This is the landscape then, and looking now at a 1770s Armstrong roadmap, this is the landscape that Cumberland decides is where he's going to make his stand. Those of you who can remember back to the first campaign, a couple of years ago now, might remember there was a small and very disappointing skirmish at Walshford here during that campaign too. So in some ways, it's familiar territory. So let's have a look at the landscape we have before us. The main feature of the landscape, the Great North Road itself, seen here running into Walshford village, and at Walshford it passes coaching in and then over the bridge on the Nid. So the Jacobites will need to get their army across this bridge if they want to continue down the main road into the heart of England. To the east of Walshford is Huntingdon, and that is on high ground, dominated by its church, overlooking the river, and overlooking a ford leading to Culthorpe. And of course it's of antiquarian rather than tactical interest, but the track across the ford between Hunsinger and Culthorpe takes you past the Culthorpe Oak, one of the oldest trees in England, although even by 1745 it was being propped up with wooden struts. In Culthorpe itself, there's the hall, and then there's the church and the churchyard, but then there is a large open area, very gently sloping, so it's a large, open, unobstructive area with the Great North Road running through it. Note also that towards the western side of our battlefield, there is a lane with hedges on either side of it, the sort of obstacle that might prevent a Highland charge. Over on the western side of our battlefield, then there's another ford at Ribston, which brings you down to the River Crimple, a smaller tributary of the Nid, which has to be crossed as well. And then the track leads from there to North Dayton, and that track leading on from the village eventually joins with the Great North Road as it heads towards Wetherby at the south of the battlefield. So Cumberland brings his army up from Wetherby and decides to take up a position across here. The advantage of North Dayton to him is, as you can just about make out there, is that there is in fact an area of high ground on this relatively flat landscape. It's actually the old motte of a former castle site, and this gives him a position that is back from the river that invites the Jacobites to come and deploy and attack it. The Jacobites, if they want to come, though, do have to get across the river. They have the main crossing at Walshford, they have the ford at Hunsinger, and, of course, the crossing here at Ribston too. And so Cumberland brings his army up and deploys a full day ahead of the Jacobites' arrival. Cumberland has succeeded in concentrating all of his forces, his own infantry, Fulk's cavalry, and Hawley's army, all drawn together to create the most powerful force we've seen yet in the campaign. It's a very formidable obstacle, and the danger is that it's so formidable the Jacobites will simply decline attacking and will withdraw. Lacking cavalry, it's not until the Jacobites are fairly close to Cumberland's position that they detect that he's deploying battle. The question is, and here they are arriving at Walshford Bridge, are they going to risk coming across? Are they going to come and accept the challenge of battle? Of course they are. There is now, from the Jacobites' perspective, nothing to be gained by shying away. If they attempt to retreat from this position, they will have a powerful enemy army in their rear. If they do not accept the opportunity for battle, now that they've got all of their forces together and all of the enemy's forces are concentrated, then they will lose face potentially, and their strategic plans for the campaign are in ruins. On the other side, if they can win here, if they can destroy this force, the road to London is open. The Jacobites cross the bridge. And so the stage is set for what we're calling the Battle of Wetherby. To the north of Wetherby, just to the north, in fact, of where Wetherby services are today, and Wetherby Racecourse too. On the 29th of December, our two armies engage. It's an engagement that doesn't begin until the afternoon, and it will be the bloodiest battle of our war so far. Here's a quick look along Cumberland's line then. Nearest to us is Albemarle's division at North Dayton. The infantry are drawn up here with artillery. They're drawn up in two lines. They also have Kerr's Dragoons down there in support as well. Then there's the Halmire, the hill on which two batteries of guns are mounted, dominating position on Cumberland's line there. Then Cumberland's centre, firstly Hawley's division there, 4 regiments of foot and a heavy horse unit behind, and then beyond Ligonier's strong 4-regiment division as well. Beyond them are the cavalry held in reserve by Fulk, and then another division facing towards Calthorpe, and that is Husk's division. Predictably enough, the main Jacobite force begins to cross at Walshford Bridge. The Prince, you can see him there on the left, taking up a position initially at the Coaching Inn beside the river. Still there. Now, here we see the advance across the river being led mainly by the Athol Brigade, supported by the Stuart Svapin and the Clancameron, 2 of the smaller battalions, both of whom have taken heavy losses during the course of the campaign so far. Also, Drummond's division coming up here, Lowlanders and French troops supported by artillery. The Jacobites have lost some of their artillery after the engagement at Fort William. You might recall they lost a battery of medium guns there and a battery of mortars. But they still have 3 batteries of guns and some heavy Royal mortars that can do a lot of damage too. More Jacobite units crossing over the ford south of Holsingor, and here you see them here. They've got the McLaughlins at the front, Clanranald, John Roy Stewart's regiment, and Glenbucket's just coming in behind, moving towards Calthorpe Church, which is where the Jacobites move their initial mortars and artillery. Now, this is a potentially big battle and potentially a confusing one, so I've tried to make it simpler using the amazing Battle Chronicler software. As you can see, once again, I really do think very highly of this software, and it's completely free. Here it is then, the Jacobites moving over Walshford Bridge, initially struggling to get themselves deployed in the centre, whilst the other Highland division comes across here. And you can see opposite, Cumberland's army well placed to respond to anything happening here, and also to any possible and the likely threat coming through Ribston. However, the Duke of Cumberland's intention is to remain relatively static, at least at the start of the engagement, because what he wants is for the Jacobites to move into this landscape, to deploy, and then to be exposed to his superior firepower. He wants his artillery and his disciplined volleys. If he stays still, the platoon fire of the British line should be able to disorder any charge that threatens to come in. This is the opportunity that the British team have been waiting for. While the rest of the Jacobite units are moving up onto the field and starting to deploy, they open fire with the battery and with the mortars at Culthorpe Church. Now, it's extreme range to Husk's division, but it's close enough for a few dropping shots to fall amongst the waiting redcoats. And extraordinarily, completely contrary to the intended plan that the Duke has laid out to his commanders, Husk responds by moving his entire division forwards. He sees an opportunity, whilst the Jacobites are potentially still in column and not fully deployed, to knock out the artillery and the mortars, which he's very fearful of, based in that church position. So he moves his entire division forwards, but not so far forward so fast that he's able to get there before the Jacobites are able to deploy and charge. Has the battle already got off to an extremely dangerous start for Cumberland's forces? Here then is the situation as the opening moves take place. Two Jacobite divisions moving up and forming towards the centre, although admittedly forming clumsily and a little slowly. Over on the Jacobite left, though, the MacLachlan's and John Roy Stewarts, supported by the Glenbuckets and the Clanranald, have rushed forwards to cover their artillery, smashing into Wolfs and Semples. The situation becomes very confused over on this flank. The Wolf and Semple battalions are rolled back by the charge, and Blakeney's behind them are shattered by John Roy Stewart's regiment, with the Glenbuckets moving up in support. It's a bad start for the British Army. It has advanced too far on the right, and it is now being rolled straight back. Cumberland has to act quickly to stabilise the situation. The first thing that he does is move Ligonier's division forwards so that Husk's isn't completely isolated on its own and exposed to fire from the Jacobite centre as well as the left. Then the horse are moved up. You can see here Cobhams have had to launch a dramatic charge into Glenbuckets in the hope of trying to ease some of the pressure. And Gardner's and Hamilton's, two small squadron survivors of previous engagements, you'll recall, who have been brigaded together to form a full-size unit, they have moved up in support behind Semples here. Cobham's charge was optimistic because it was charging a small unit and one that had taken some casualties during the fire during the initial charge, but nevertheless, and perhaps disappointingly predictably, those dragoons are driven back from the field. Here those early moves then, as the Jacobite centre begins to form, the Jacobite left pushing forwards, not breaking all of the units of Husk's division, but certainly driving it back and inflicting casualties. Meanwhile, the Lowlanders under Drummond and the French units have started to deploy in the hedged lane there. At this point, Cumberland has to decide whether to commit to his forward movement, and certainly Hawley wants him to. But what Cumberland does, as you can see there, he moves Howard's and Monroe's forwards to support Ligonier's, but he keeps Barrel's and Fleming's back, just in case they are needed to transfer towards the right if that flank gets into even deeper trouble. Here we see it then in the centre. These nearest two units are from Hawley's. They've moved up, and beyond them, the Royal North British Dragoons. They are advanced forwards because another regiment has been rolled back by the advancing Clan Cameron, but the Camerons have had to advance through the Athol Brigade, who were disordered. Will they themselves be able to make much further progress? No, because a devastating close-range volley has routed the Clan Cameron, a small unit badly battered through the course of the campaign and now driven from the field, the first glimmer of success for the British Army. But that glimmer of hope seems transitory because the 2nd Battalion of the Athol Brigade is able to recover its disorder and push forwards into the wake of the routing Camerons and drive back the Redcoats. A danger here, perhaps, of splitting the British centre. Nevertheless, beyond them, the Royal North British Fusiliers are doggedly holding on against the other battalion of the Athol Brigade and the Stuarts of Appin. Here, though, you can also see that the Lowlanders and the Irish pickets, with some of the Jacobite artillery, are now starting to deploy on the lane to put fire into Hawley's men there. Other Jacobite guns still struggling to get up across the bridge. Now the question is, where are the rest of the Jacobite army? Are they still struggling across the fords at Ribston? Cumberland can't see them from his position, but that's where he's assumed they're going to come. And come they do, but not across the river at Ribston. They come through Hunsinger and Colthorpe. And so a new division has thrown itself onto the right of the British position, the position that was already starting to falter and fall back. Now, when these Clandonald men come out onto the field, supported by the Frasers of Lovat, they actually take pause themselves, seeing the carnage that's already been wrought over this end of the battlefield. It requires the prince to ride across to this end of the field to give them the initiative they need to drive forwards. A sudden massed weight of Jacobite Highlanders appearing at the most vulnerable part of the British line. But by massing everybody on this side, it means that Albemarle's division on the British left has nothing to fight and can now be swung into action against the Jacobite centre, or rather, what it has now become, the Jacobite right. Well, let's try and make some sense out of that on the map. You can see at the top right the Glengarry, Keppoch and Fraser's regiments coming down onto the field, pouring power into the Jacobite left and centre left. Now, that's already where the British line has been driven back. Cobham's dragoons advancing to try and stem the tide, but driven back themselves, and the situation looking pretty desperate. Cumberland is obliged to bring the barrels and Flemings and one of the guns from Hawley's division across his rear to basically come up in the expectation that his right flank is about to collapse. But the appearance of the last Jacobite divisions on the field over on this far side means that Albemarle, over on the left, has been able to move up towards the lane and put some fire into what has now become the Jacobite right, Drummond's division. Desperate to capitalise on the shock and surprise of the appearance of fresh units over on their left, the Jacobites are pushing in the centre as hard as they can. They need to break through here before Albemarle's fresher troops are able to turn that flank. So the Fitzjames Horse and Elchos have moved forwards in support of the Athol Brigade. There is a danger, if they don't get support, that they can break through only to be enfiladed by the British infantry beyond. They are really held up here by the Royal North British Fusiliers, who are doggedly holding on in a desperate hand-to-hand fight with the other battalion of the Athol Brigade and the Stuarts behind them. Unless or until they can break the Royal North British here, the Jacobite centre simply can't get through. And so perhaps inevitably that 2nd Battalion of the Athol Brigade that's out there on a limb is shattered by close quarters fire from the British Reserve line there. But it exposes the British infantry to the Jacobite artillery and the fire of Dillon's beyond, and so by no means is everything certain. The snarl up in the centre, where the Royal North British Fusiliers are holding their ground. But then look at this. The Jacobite thrust through Keppoch's, Glengarry's and the Frasers, stoving into the line there, dispensing with any attempt to break what's left of Husk's regiments and going straight for the middle of the British line in the hope of punching through, splitting it in half, taking its guns and securing the road to London. The fighting is intense. Regiments are being broken, routed, driven back, pushed forwards all across the line. It is so tense, it is so uncertain which army can break through. Just as it looks like the British line is starting to stabilise, things start to unravel again. Here the Royal North British Fusiliers are finally broken by a charge into their flank from the Glenbuckets. This now will allow regiments from the centre of the Jacobite line to move forwards in coordination with those fresh troops charging in from the Clandonald. And at this same moment, Wolfe's regiment, which had been battered, blooded and forced back in the earliest stages of the battle, is now completely shattered by mortar fire that falls upon its men and inflicts so many casualties that the regiment simply can't stand it any longer. Another unit breaks from the field. The whole battle is now starting to seesaw. You can see Albemarle has gained ground on the British left, pushing up into and beyond the hedges and threatening to turn the Jacobite flank here. But the disciplined fire of the French regiments and supporting artillery are holding back Kerr's dragoons from turning them completely. Meanwhile, the Jacobites have committed everything into this thrust to the centre right of the British line, pushing forwards. The Barrel's regiment are desperately trying to hold against a wave upon wave of charging Highlanders. But crucially, you can see here, Cumberland himself has been able to bring up some of his reserves, especially Fleming's and Wade's horse, who has not yet been committed, and are now threatening to outflank that massed Jacobite column. And yet, Husk's division, what's left of it, has been pushed ever further back towards the very limits of the battlefield. It's still possible that the Jacobites will turn the British right, just as the British left is attempting to turn the Jacobites. Everything now seems to depend on the grinding combat in the centre of the line. Here you can see the Glengarrys, with Keppoch's behind, with the Frasers of Lovat behind, a massed charge. And terrifying though it is, Barrel's regiment seems to be holding. The fighting is brutal and the stakes couldn't be higher, because if barrels are broken, there is almost nothing behind them. In fact, one Jacobite regiment has already broken through and overrun one of the batteries of British guns. Cumberland himself is almost cut off from his left as the attack pushes back his centre. The Prince senses that this is the crucial moment. He can see that the Appins have managed to break through over here, but they're unsupported and they're exposed to flanking fire from Monroe's and from the artillery on How Hill, who are now firing directly into the flank of the Appins. Cumberland, he might have been cut off from his left, but he's stabilising the line. Charles Edward moves forwards with the Athol Brigade and tries to push forwards because casualties are mounting. Barrel's regiment manages to break the Glengarrys, and then they managed to break Keppoch's too. And in fact, now, all along the line, disordered, shattered by close quarters volleys, the Jacobite line is beginning to lose its momentum, falter and break. At the same time, Ogilvy's Lowlanders have been driven out of the hedges, and now that they're cleared and Dijon's have been able to move forwards to the Écosse, Kerr's dragoons are able to charge into the flank of the retreating Lowlanders. The Athol Brigade is now almost entirely alone in the centre of the Jacobite position, the Prince with it, and Wade's horse, uncommitted so far, held in reserve, are now able to charge first against the Jacobite lifeguards, then into the Athol Brigade itself. Here's a view back across to the left. You can see the situation for Albemarle. He was reluctant initially to use Kerr's dragoons to charge either the Écosse or that artillery battery because of the amount of fire they could put in. So instead, Dijon's are advanced so that they draw the fire of the Écossois, and Kerr's are able to then charge over across on the extreme flank. But just as Kerr's are doing it, Ogilvy's men are forced to retreat from the hedges, and Kerr smashes into their flank. But it's back here in the Jacobite centre that the decisive moment comes. Wade's heavy horse are able to smash through the last remaining battalion of the Athol Brigade, and look how close they are to Charles Edward Stuart himself. At this point, his aides seize his bridle and drag him away from the danger point, away from the centre, away from the last hope of his victory. The only intact regiment he still has on the field, able to cover his withdrawal, is the Frasers of Lovat, who waste no time in escorting him all the way back to Walshford Bridge and getting him across that crossing. If they don't do it quickly, then the charge of Kerr's dragoons is sure to break through what's left of Ogilvy's and then potentially cut the Jacobites off from their line of retreat. Luckily, the Frasers do get there first. The Prince is able to escape, And as day turns towards night, the French regiments of Drummond's division are able to get back to the bridge as well, to put in enough covering fire to prevent an immediate pursuit across Walshford Bridge. Many of the British units that are still on the field are badly shaken by the battle so far. One more good volley could break another, and so there's a lot of reluctance to push this too far. Instead, the artillery will be brought up to finish this last engagement over on the British left. Over at Colthorpe, the Duke of Perth has withdrawn to the position of the artillery that had opened the battle. Most of his regiments now shattered. Perth orders the artillery to keep firing as long as they dare to allow the escape of the last Jacobite cavalry unit, the Fitzjames horse, who'd been driven back by the advance of Kingston's horse. But again, with this massive artillery over on this flank, there was a reluctance to make an immediate pursuit. Perth, without any of its men, slips away with what remains of the French horse. Here we are at the close of the day then, the British able to form back into some form of line, dressing their units back from any exposure to final fire in these last phases of the day. Artillery brought up from How Hill, and first the guns over at Colthorpe are silenced, the gunners slipping away towards the river, and then at Walshford Bridge, the French regiments and Lord John Drummond himself surrendering to Albemarle as prisoners of war. In the coming hours, the Prince, north of the river now, is able to rally what little he can of the remnants of his army. He has the aid of the fact that so far into England, the best way for his men to remain safe and alive is to band back together as quickly as they can. The survivors of the battle reform their colours, and what is left of the Jacobite army begins to look for a way to try and salvage this campaign from this battle. But as night falls over the battlefield, the British army is in a state of shock too. 8 of its battalions broken on the field. Half of its cavalry broken on the field. Sure, over the next day or so, as word spreads of the victory, many of these men will rally back to their colours. But that doesn't disguise the fact that losses have been heavy, the battle had been hard fought, and it was only the successful junction of so much of Hawley's survivors from the earlier campaign and the fresh veteran troops of Cumberland that enabled them to hold firm. Had either force been forced to fight independently, the Jacobites could have broken them. So there's little cause for celebration, but there is confidence now that all of the Jacobites' momentum has been broken. But that doesn't mean that the war is over. A big question still remains. Did the French hear of the Jacobite penetration into England, and have they decided to commit troops in support? Will those troops have embarked before word reaches them of the Jacobite army's defeat? If so, will the British army, now at its moment of triumph, be forced to face a threat from the south, rather than destroying what remains of the Prince's army in the north? The Duke of Argyll had been detached by Hawley to send his division to lay siege to the Jacobites at Stirling Castle. Will they be surprised by the sudden appearance of the remnants of the Jacobite field army? Or can Cumberland get word to them before that threat emerges? There's lots still to come, I'm sure. Has the tide irretrievably turned against the Jacobites? Remains to be seen.